Welcome everyone, I am back with my follow-up video on my $700 build of the month for November 2023. When I first pitched this build a couple weeks ago in my monthly builds video, I got some feedback from the fans who said, Paul, even though you're trying to do Intel solid and recognize a lot of the advancements that they've made over the past year with their driver support for their ARC A750, A770, A580 GPUs and so forth, there is still some stiff competition out there in the budget GPU space. Not from Nvidia, they're still insulting everyone with the RTX 3050, but from AMD, who has gotten more and more competitive with the prices for their RX 6000 series, and most specifically the RX 6650 XT, which can now be found for about $230, even $220 US. So I decided when I was building this system that I would test both cards. I have done that, and I'll be sharing the results with you today.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Lexar's NM790 NVMe SSDs, providing lightning-fast storage for the latest generation of gaming and workstation PCs. Featuring a high-bandwidth PCIe Gen 4x4 interface, broad compatibility thanks to the M.2 form factor, and capacities up to 4 terabytes with sequential read speeds up to 7,400 megabytes per second, the NM790 makes no compromises and is conveniently available with or without an integrated heatsink. It's also a perfect pairing for Lexar's stable, reliable, and efficient Thor OC DDR5 memory kits too, so click the sponsor link in the description for more. First off, if you'd like to build this system or a system similar to it, I have links to all the parts that I used down in the video's description. I've also discussed pretty extensively at this point the various configurations for this build. It's going to cost around $700 to $800 depending on whether or not you invest in upgrades like going with a 32 gigabyte DDR4 memory kit versus saving a few dollars and going with the 16 gigabyte kit. Going with the Ryzen 5 5600X as I have done versus the 5600, you can save another $20 or $30 there depending on current pricing. And of course the SSD you choose for your primary storage, you can get a 1 terabyte NVMe SSD for about $35 or $40 right now, or go for a 2 terabyte option for $70 to $80. I do have a couple notes on the build after getting the system set up with Windows installed and everything. I did notice some coil whine. It was pretty minor, but it depended on the situation. If I was in a game menu, for example, and I was running at a really high frame rate, it would become more pronounced. But generally speaking, while I was running the gaming tests, the coil whine was reduced or not noticeable at all. The second thing I wanted to note is that since we're using the Wraith Stealth cooler that comes with the 5600X, we're really getting away with the bare minimum in terms of CPU cooling, and a CPU cooler upgrade would very much be on my short list of things I would want to do to this system. CPU cooler upgrade and going from 16 to 32 gigabytes of VRAM would be probably my top two, but in certain situations, even with the lower TDP of the 5600X, I was pushing up to 90 to even 95 degrees Celsius, and I did notice some stuttering with some of the game tests I was doing, specifically Horizon Zero Dawn, which I ended up leaving out of my suite of tests simply because it was behaving so inconsistently, and I think it was actually the CPU that was not keeping up in those situations, not the graphics card, although there was no actual throttling reported. I ended up leaving Horizon Zero Dawn out of my test results simply because it was behaving inconsistently, and thankfully after some minor tweaks in the BIOS, just upping the fan curve for the CPU fan just slightly, I was able to keep those temperatures down below 90 for the duration of my tests. That being said, let's get into my test results, starting with a look at the stats between the two graphics cards in question, the Intel Arc A750 and the AMD Radeon RX 6650 XT. Both of these cards have 8 gigs of VRAM. They're very comparable in terms of their base stats. Of course, the performance is what's really going to make the difference. You might have noticed that the Arc A750 has 2 GPU power connectors, an 8-pin and a 6-pin, whereas the RX 6650 XT only has a single 8-pin, and that is reflected in the power draw numbers as well. Generally speaking, the A750 was drawing about 40 to 50 watts more than the 6650 XT, which isn't that much by comparison and probably isn't going to be a big deal for you if you're building a budget system. However, when we compare the performance numbers, do note that the 6650 XT is doing all of that while drawing less power. I'm going to start off with a couple synthetic tests from 3D Mark, and these are not included in my cumulative results. 3D Mark Times by Extreme runs at 4K, so this is a pretty intensive test to throw out these budget cards, but here's where I want to point out that on paper and in a test that's fairly heavily optimized as the 3D Mark tests are, the Arc A750 actually outperforms the 6650 XT by a fairly decent margin, with a graphics score over 6,000 compared to the 6650 XTs, which is around 4,660. Spoiler alert, this advantage falls off pretty quickly when we get into actual testing, but it is a good representation perhaps of how far Intel still has to go in terms of driver maturity and getting more out of these graphics cards. Here's a look at 3D Mark's Port Royal ray tracing test, and here again the A750 has the advantage, and if you're really into ray tracing and you're going to play a a lot of heavily ray traced titles, the A750 might have an edge in that category. Moving into actual games, starting with Far Cry 6, we're testing at 2560 by 1440 as shown here. I also have 1080 results in a moment, but right out of the gate, the A750 falls pretty significantly behind, only 84.8 average frames per second versus the 6650, which output 102. Switching over to 1080, and the ARC A750 catches up just a little bit, managing the top 100 FPS, 102.9, although the 6650 XT still maintains a lead, hitting 110 FPS. That's about an 8.5% advantage for the 6650 at 1080, and about a 20% advantage at 1440. Here is Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 2560 by 1440. Again, the 6650 XT has the lead by about 15%, getting up to 110.1 average frames per second, while the ARC A750 was at 95.6. And at 1080, the 6650 XT extends its lead a little bit more. It's 20% ahead here, hitting 155.8 frames per second. Please also note that features like DLSS and XESS have been disabled for these tests, so we can get a raw performance comparison between the cards. If you're looking at the frame rates I'm showing on screen and you're thinking, wow, I would like to see a higher frame rate than that for my 2560 by 1440 144 Hz gaming monitor, for example, do note that with many of these games you can enable features like XESS or FSR to get yourself higher frame rates with a slight hit to image quality. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, which seems to only have gained popularity since it debuted. At 2560 by 1440, the A750 wins. It's a minor win. It's a 1 FPS win, but it is a win nonetheless. So I'd like to extend my congratulations to Intel and their team who has been working on drivers for coming up with this big win in Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440. Unfortunately though, at 1080, the 6650 XT takes the lead once again, getting up to 102.3 FPS. So while the 6650 XT is down by about 2.5% at 1440, at 1080 it is back up by 16%. Next up is Dirt 5 at 1440, and here the results are fairly close. The ARC A750 is about 9% behind, hitting 92.4 frames per second on average versus the just over 100 that the 6650 XT got. And at 1080, the 6650 XT extends the lead about 16% ahead of the A750, 130 FPS versus 111. Next are some live gameplay tests for a side-by-side comparison. We're looking at Doom Eternal, which is a Vulkan-based game. We're running the Ultra preset with DLSS turned off, and we're starting off at 2560 by 1440, where the A750 was averaging around 150 to 155 frames per second. This is not a built-in benchmark, this is me actually playing the game, so the comparison between the two shots you're looking at is probably going to vary just a little bit, but you should also be able to tell that the 6650 XT is maintaining a decent 20 FPS or so lead. It's averaging closer to 170 to 175 frames per second. If we switch over to 1080, we're going to get a higher frame rate, so the 6650 XT here is getting closer to 250, 260 FPS, while the A750 is averaging closer to the 220 to 230 FPS range. And even though the 6650 XT is winning here, I'd like to point out that in either case, and this is without the advantages of XESS or any other sort of upscaling feature, we're hitting frame rates that would be ideal for a 2560 by 1440 144 Hz refresh rate monitor or a 1080 240 Hz refresh rate monitor. Next up we have Starfield, which is a recent game, so it's fairly new to my test suite, and it is a game that Intel really struggled with out of the gate. It took them a few days, if not a week or so after launch, to get even a functional driver out for Starfield, and they have improved things along the way, but not as much as AMD has. So you can see here at 1440, the A750 is struggling a fairly decent amount, below 30 frames per second, averaging around 26 or 27, while the 6650 XT is at a much more comfortable 52 FPS. Dropping the resolution to 1080 gets us a few more frames out of the A750. It's more in the 33 FPS average at this point, whereas the 6650 XT is much closer to 70 frames per second. Last game I'm testing is Microsoft Flight Simulator, mostly because every time I test Flight Simulator, there's at least a few people in the comments who are like, Paul, thanks for testing Flight Simulator. It's a game I like. And it's also a game that the ARC A750 is much more competitive in. We're about 12% or so behind, depending on when you look at the frame rates here, with the 6650 XT getting to about 53 average FPS and the A750 hovering around 47. And I sincerely hope that my editor Joe cuts this off before we get to my landing in this test. Oh dear. Okay. Switching over to 1080, we're going to get a bit higher frame rate, although Flight Simulator is somewhat notoriously CPU bound. Still, we're at 63 frames per second or so on average from the 6650 XT, and only about 10 FPS behind that with the ARC A750. And here at least I nailed one of my landings. That wasn't too bad. And now we move on to my overall performance results, evenly weighted between the 7 games that were tested today using the ARC A750 as the 100% baseline. We can see at 2560 by 1440, the 6650 XT outperformed the A750 by about 23.7%, and even beyond that at 1920 by 1080, close to 30% ahead. So if we add in the prices as of a couple weeks ago, we can see that the 6650 XT is pretty clearly going to be the winner here. For only $10 more, you're getting significantly more performance, so yes, the 6650 XT is going to be the bang for the buck champion. But wait, it's Black Friday week, and double checking the prices just before I shot this video revealed that, as I mentioned several times, the ARC A750 is a much more compelling value at around $180 to $190, and guess what the price has dropped down to? Newegg has a Black Friday deal for the Sparkle Intel ARC A750 Orc Edition for $180 right now. The 6650 XT has also dropped in price, and it's even this exact model that I tested today. However, that was only by $10 to $220. So if we look at those updated prices, it becomes a more difficult decision as to which graphics card to buy. I would opt for the 6650 XT because more power and more performance, but maybe $40 is a pretty significant dollar amount to you, and maybe the performance you've seen out of the A750 today, combined with perhaps more performance that Intel might continue to squeeze out of it with additional driver updates in the future, makes it the more compelling option for you. I'm really glad that the price dropped though, because I didn't want to say just like, hey guys, A750 is not worth it right now. I think it still is at this price for someone who's on a strict budget, for someone who's maybe a little bit inclined to try out ray tracing titles where it does outperform the 6650 XT, or even someone who wants to leverage some of the extra bonus features of the A750 like the included AV1 hardware encoder, or the fact that it's actually quite good for generative AI work like Stable Diffusion. But after viewing my numbers and the test results today, and particularly in light of some of the recent price drops, I'm very curious to know what you guys think. Would you lean towards the 6650 XT for $40 more, or the ARC A750, especially if that price holds at around $180 to $190, which, at the risk of being repetitive, I think is the price that this card should sell for right now. I would also very much like to hear from anyone who is on the cusp of building a new gaming PC right now. If you're in the process of choosing your parts, let me know if this video has helped you out at all, and of course check the video description down below for links to the parts I built with today, as well as some alternative parts if you wanted to build this system but make it full-size ATX using some of the components that I built with last month. But that is all the time I have for today, so once again guys, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button on your way out, and check the video's description down below for links to all the stuff that I talked about, as well as a link to my store at paulshardware.net. It is the season for giving, and I have t-shirts, hoodies, beer sets, and more available, and they are all very high quality. A final closing reminder to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you're not already, for more videos like this coming at you real soon. Thanks again for watching guys, and we'll see you all in the next video.